All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening in this introduction for office bearers. This is the second this year in a series of webinars we'll be conducting for our member associations in understanding your roles, responsibilities and the operations of your PNC. We hope you enjoyed the content. It is quite extensive tonight, so I will be moving through it at a fairly rapid rate of knots, but there is obviously the opportunity to ask questions at the end. So before we start, in the spirit of reconciliation, PNC Federation would acknowledge the traditional custodians on the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. And we pay our respects past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today. So in terms of our housekeeping tonight, we have a Q&A section within Zoom for you to ask questions. Please confine your questions to the Q&A section because our team who is present behind the scenes will be able to answer your questions during the night, provided we don't get swamped. Please don't use the Q&A section for your comments. There is actually a chat section for that. So if you want to say hello to somebody else, please use the chat section. We will try and attempt to answer all of the questions that you raised tonight, but in the event that we can't, we'll get to those post-webinar and we'll post the answers to those along with the recording of the webinar on the members portal within a week of this event. Please ensure that all your posts are respectful, appropriate, and don't discriminate against or defame others. Please don't identify individual people or schools in your comments or endorse or like damaging or disrespectful comments made by others, please. And if you would like to have a live transcript of this webinar, please go to the icon at the bottom of your screen and click the Enable Auto Transcription option. Right, we have a fairly extensive agenda tonight, so I'll just go through what we're going to cover for those of you in attendance. We have a section which will cover what a PNC Association is, so it gives you some clarity as an office bearer about what a PNC Association is in terms of its composition and what it's supposed to be doing. It's often an area where a lot of people will get a little confused, or there's some myths or legends existing around what a PNC Association is and can do. So we'll hopefully clarify that for you tonight. We'll go into the governance and structure, rules and responsibilities that surround the PNC Association. That's talking about how your structure is implemented under the Constitution, what rules apply, your roles and responsibilities, which is always a biggie for most office bearers. What do each of the individual office bearer roles entail? We'll go into that in a bit of detail. And we'll talk also about what it is meant by not-for-profit. Again, an area that's often a little bit confusing for people. It's a term that's used in general language in a very loose way, and we'll put some more clarity around that tonight so you understand how a PNC Association fits in that space. And we'll look a little bit at your legal obligations as an office bearer and from the PNC's perspective. So you get an overview of what applies in your particular instance, and we'll do it in such a way that you can tack on what you actually need or understand what you need based on the sort of things your PNC Association is operating. And at the end, we'll have some time for a Q&A session, and we'll do our best to answer the questions you've posed to us tonight. So let's get underway and go into what a PNC Association actually is. Now, this is a two-parter, so I'm going to cover it from two angles. It's who makes up a PNC Association, and then what a PNC Association is obligated to do. So from the membership side, PNC Association is comprised of parent members who are parents or legal guardians of children who are enrolled at the school. And that may include PNC employees and school staff in that particular cohort. they are eligible to join as a parent member. The other side is a citizen member, hence the name, Parent and Citizen Association. And they are people who reside within the school's enrolment area, but don't have children at the school. And they may include staff and PNC employees as well in that space. So both of those together make up, along with the school principal, who's an ex officio member of the PNC. That's because of their position as principal. And the reason they are there is because they represent the Department of Education and they are the leader, the school leader. They are there because they have expertise in the curriculum and school operations, and it's only appropriate they sit within the PNC to offer advice and guidance as to how the school operates and how the PNC can be of assistance to the school. So all of those combined together form a PNC association. So that's your membership base. Anyone that sits outside of that space is technically ineligible to be a member of the PNC Association. So the other side of that coin is dealing with the objectives of PNC. What does a PNC actually do, or what is it required to do? And this is often misunderstood. A lot of people will think of a PNC simply as a fundraising entity, and that's partly right, but it is a lot more than that. So these objectives, and there's 3 of them, are taken straight from the Education Act. The first one is to promote the interests of the school by bringing parents, citizens, students, and teaching staff into close cooperation. So this is a facilitation and a forum style goal for a PNC. The idea behind this is to bring people together to build community. And we're hoping that that's what most PNCs are attempting to do. By bringing everyone together and sharing the interests and the skills of various members of the community, you enrich that community by sharing their skills and allowing them to contribute and participate in PNC activities. Usually, as part of this, you build up incredible friendships, and usually ones that last for a very, very long time, especially during the time of your child's schooling. And it also builds close friendships between families as well. So if it's done well, the community building in this particular aspect of a PNC's objective contributes to the bringing together of volunteers and builds an interest in the operations and the things going on at the school. The second objective is to assist in providing facilities and equipment for the school and in promoting the recreation and welfare of the students at the school. So in this particular case, you've got the fundraising aspect quite clearly stated there. A PNC's role is to provide facilities and equipment for the school. And the caveat around that will be, it talks about facilities and equipment, not paying for staff at the school, educational staff. So that's something that we often call out because there is a potential risk associated with paying directly for a staff member or part thereof. And by limiting it to facilities and equipment for the school, you're keeping out of that fair work space and lowering the risk to the PNC Association by doing so. If the school's really wanting to find some funding for a staff member, we always sort of say to our members, please look at alternative ways of getting around that. So that would be providing facilities and equipment in exchange for the school finding the money for that staff member out of their own budget. In terms of promoting the recreation and welfare of the students, that's reasonably straightforward. So anything that you can do to help alleviate the educational stress on the children at the school by providing some form of recreation or relaxation for them outside of their classroom environment and supporting the welfare of the students at the school. And that goes directly to a PNC being able to support wellbeing or welfare programs that may be external to the school as well. And the last one is to encourage parent and community participation in curriculum. and other issues in schools. And the caveat on that from the Education Act is where there is no school council. Now, school councils were a thing going back a few decades. They still exist, but there's not that many of them around anymore. So it is more than likely that your PNC or your school does not have a school council. So you are well and truly within your remit to encourage parent and community participation in curriculum and other issues. You have on tap a very highly skilled group of people in the principal, school leadership team and the teachers in understanding the curriculum and how your children are being taught. And it's a really good practice to involve the teaching staff with cooperation of the school leadership team to come and explain to parents about the curriculum, the types of things that your child is learning and how they are learning. Great opportunity for parents to become involved in their child's education, and a great idea for parents to understand exactly what's going on in the classrooms at school. So we completely encourage a PNC to step into that space and make sure that you team up with the school to provide stuff, especially at general meetings, for instance. You can have guest speakers from each of the KLAs at the school, the key learning areas, to come in and provide presentations on what's going on within your school. It gives you a much greater insight into exactly what your child's learning and why they're learning that. So a little bit about the relationship with the school, because this is really important as an office bearer to understand what's going on between two entities that are effectively separate in a lot of cases. So the PNC Association, as we've just looked at, has three primary goals. And you could summarize that as supporting the school in general. The school, on the other side, according to the department's strategic plan, has the goal of making every student engaged and challenged to continue to learn, and that every student, teacher, leader in school improves every year. So their remit is purely educational. And when you look at this from two separate sides, each one has its own legislative requirements and policies under which it needs to operate. And in that respect, both sides, the school and the PNC Association, need to understand that there is a line in the sand where both parties shouldn't cross. And in fact, there is a clause in the PNC Association's constitution that talks about not directing school staff or the programs at the school. And that's that line in the sand. The PNC Association is there to help support the school. It's not there to run the school. So it's a very important distinction to make. The opposite side of that too is that the PNC Association is an autonomous organisation. It is separate from the department and the school. It is a registered business, and it is autonomous in the sense that it makes its own decisions and has to live by those decisions. So the school, although it has the facilities that the PNC Association will often use to carry out its activities, the PNC Association, by and large, is completely separate from the school, other than the fact that you are directly associated with the school under the Education Act. You could not exist without the school existing. In the middle of that is a bunch of shared objectives and responsibilities that both parties need to understand exist. So a lot of that stuff comes down to things like working with children checks, so child protection, work health and safety. The principal is also a member of the PNC Association, so has a foot in both camps. So there are a number of shared things that you need to be aware of that you will need to collaborate and cooperate with the school on. And the school needs to be mindful that the PNC has its own obligations under law that it shouldn't be stepping on. So working out those shared objectives and responsibilities and making sure that both parties understand that there is a central area there where they need to cooperate, and the primary one being to support the students at the school, which I hope both parties will be doing. Once you have that goal in mind, it brings both of those things closer together, as long as there's a very clear understanding that you need, each one of these entities needs to have clear space to do what it's been legislated to do. So in terms of the direct relationship for the school, and we want it to be a really positive one, it's basically the relationship between the president and the principal that is key in this space. It's not always those two that are talking, because at PNC meetings, you will have the broader membership of the PNC Association there, along with the principal and possibly some members of the executive team or the teaching staff. But it's bringing those things together through the president and the principal as the primary points of contact that's really important in the relationship with the school. So let's delve a little bit more into the governance of a PNC. This is how a PNC is meant to operate, its structure, the rules that govern it, and how you as an office bearer fit into that picture. So a PNC can be one of two flavours, if you like. Incorporated PNC, which is the bulk of PNCs in New South Wales, is basically an association that is a legal entity all of itself. The incorporation allows it to have a legal standing, and that allows the association to have debts and liabilities that are separate from you as members and as office bearers. So if the PNC should, for any reason, have a large number of debts and liabilities and you end up having to wind the association up, you are largely separated from the debts and liabilities of that. It comes directly from the entity rather than having to sell your house. The staff, in terms of employing staff, you are able to do that because you have a legal entity behind that. You can seek grants, you can apply for loans. All of those things are possible as an incorporated entity. And the PNC can also own property in its own name. That means if you go out and buy a barbecue for all of those election barbecues that you will be doing, it basically means the PNC can own that barbecue and it doesn't end up becoming a distributed entity across all of the members. And that's exactly what happens in an unincorporated PNC. There's only about, I think, around 16% of our members that are unincorporated, and they're generally very small PNCs that don't do a lot of fundraising. They're not a legal entity. The members are actually liable for the debts and liabilities, and it's much harder, if not impossible, to employ and seek grants in that space. And the PNC can't actually own the property itself. The property is actually owned by all the members at the time. So there's a substantial difference between the two. We do recommend that PNCs consider becoming incorporated with PNC Federation. At the moment, it is free. It's a very simple process by endorsing to move to incorporation at a general meeting or a special meeting, filling in a form, sending it through to PNC Federation. It then goes through the Department of Education, is approved by the Minister, you become a gazetted, and you're incorporated from that point. There's a little bit of paperwork that needs to be done in the incorporated sense. If you have any of those questions, by all means, contact our member support team and they can walk you through that process. So a little bit about what governing documents are in the PNC space, and this is both for incorporated and unincorporated PNC associations. So at the top level, in terms of legislation, the Education Act is the piece of legislation that allows a PNC to exist within a public school. If you're incorporated under PNC Federation, then there's an additional piece of bespoke legislation called the Parents and Citizens and Corporations Act, which allows you to incorporate through us without having to go under fair trading and meet all of their obligations. Underneath the Act sits the Constitution, and they're basically unalterable documents. So we have a prescribed Constitution for the incorporated PNCs and a standard Constitution for the unincorporated. They're essentially the same document with a couple of clauses different that's required for incorporated entities. So all of that's basically unalterable. Underneath that sits your bylaws, your rules, and your policies. Now, these are all the bespoke things that your PNC can alter and meet and change to meet its particular needs. And PNCs, by and large, vary widely across New South Wales. So this is the space you would be playing in as a PNC to get all of those things tweaked to the way you normally do things, providing none of these things actually contradict the Constitution. So at the top level there would be your PNC bylaws. Now, they're actually required by the Constitution, and at a bare minimum, they require you to put in your annual subscription fee, when your AGM is to be held, your financial year, etc. So there's some minimum levels of things that need to be in your bylaws. If some of you out there are going, bylaws, what are they? I don't know. I haven't seen any. Ask if you've got access to anyone that was a previous office bearer, that they may be able to find the bylaws for you if they've gone missing. If you can't find them at all, and I'll push this for all PNCs actually, is that we've developed a brand new set of bylaws for associations we released last year. They're much more extensive, and bylaws by and large are actually your operating manual for your PNC. So they take your constitution and they split it out into how you run your meetings, how you deal with membership, and all of those things that you do on a common basis. So by looking at the stuff that we have actually provided for you in that context, along with a companion document that explains why the bylaws are the way they are, you'll be able to see that they're a fairly good operating manual, if you like, for running your PNC, and we strongly suggest you would look at using them or adopting them in your PNC moving forward. Underneath all of that will be sitting your rules and policies as well, and rules are particular documents. If you've got subcommittees in particular, you would be having a set of rules to govern how those subcommittees work and operate. So in other words, there are, in a sense, a terms of reference for the subcommittee, what the subcommittee should be doing, who it's reporting to, how it's reporting, and any delegated authority that it actually may have to do something in relation to what the subcommittee is set up to do. In addition, you'd be having policies as well. So those policies would include things like code of conduct, money handling, working with children or child protection, etc. So there would be policies that would sit under there that are really simple, and we have samples of those as well in the member portal that provide you with some guidance about what you do in the normal operating circumstances of a PNC, and they can be passed down to new office bearers as they come on. So there's clear guidance on how the PNC has been set up to operate. So a quick refresh of the structure of a PNC, and a lot of you will be thinking, I'm an office bearer, I'm at the top of the tree. Not actually the case. In a PNC, the members are actually the decision makers. So everything you do, all key decisions, including financial expenditure, needs to go to the members for a decision. As an office bearer, you sit, in a sense, underneath that, and the five of you that sit in that space have a particular set of responsibilities for managing the PNC Association. You could opt, and it's an optional thing, for an additional 6 executive members to go along with you. You can have 0, you can have 6, or you can have anything in between. It's up to you entirely to choose that. Anything you don't fill becomes a casual vacancy that can be filled at any general meeting. So it's not a lock-in at the AGM and then you have to wait a year to get people in. You can get people in at any general meeting. All of those people together make up what's referred to as the executive. And the executive is charged with the management and operations of the PNC Association. So in other words, they carry out the decisions of the members on behalf of the organisation and ensure that the PNC meets its legislative obligations. So in a sense, the executive, and in particular the office bearers, are given a certain amount of delegated authority by the members to undertake the operation of that PNC Association on behalf of the members. but they are always accountable to the members for the things that they do. And sitting underneath that, you may or may not have subcommittees. And the idea behind a subcommittee basically is to assist in the management of particular operations. So if you run a canteen or a uniform shop, an USH, a band program, whatever it might be, subcommittees can, in some instances, help you manage those particular concerns by adding a little bit of extra volunteer help into that space. Again, they need rules to operate, otherwise you may well lose control of what the subcommittee is actually meant to be doing. So it's something that you need to keep very mindful of when forming a subcommittee, or at least reviewing a subcommittee. I'll go into that now in a bit more detail. So if you are either thinking about a subcommittee or you already have subcommittees, there's important things to remember. They can actually be created and disbanded by the PNC as needed. The Constitution doesn't provide for any need to give a reason to disband a PNC, but there's some best practices around this in terms of creating, giving some form or context to the subcommittee. And if you're going to disband one, just be aware that possibly disbanding a PNC subcommittee can have financial and community ramifications you need to be aware of before you go and do it. So we strongly suggest before you go down either of those paths, you take a long deep breath, you consider what you're about to create or disband, and do the appropriate thing by taking it to the members with a paper or some other thing that supports the reasons for doing so. Subcommittees are part of your PNC Association, and they are under the PNC Association's direction. They are not separate entities at all. They are not separate business units. They may be accounted for separately in the accounting system, but by and large, they are the PNC Association's operations, and they need to do what the PNC Association wants them to do. They need to have rules to govern their operation, as I've talked about before. They generally only make recommendations to the PNC about what needs to be done in that operation or in what the subcommittee is responsible for, unless you have given them delegated authority to make certain decisions. They're responsible to the executive and the membership at all times. So whatever they do, they have to be accountable for. And subcommittee funds are always funds of the PNC Association. As I've said before, they are part of the PNC Association. They are raising money for the PNC to help support the school. Any funds, no matter if it's coming through a canteen, an USH, a band, or whatever, are always funds of the PNC Association. And the PNC Association will decide how those funds are best allocated. Should there be a surplus? Very important to remember that. Subcommittee members are also elected members at the PNC's AGM, and they are also meant to be members of the PNC, financial members of the PNC as well. So that's a little bit of a side direction into subcommittees, just so it gives you an overview of what we recommend in that space. And if you are going to review a subcommittee or you want to understand what a subcommittee is, those are the fundamental recommendations for you to look at. And we're more than happy to help you walk through any questions you might have regarding those. So a little bit about meetings. There are a number of different meetings that you are able to hold in a PNC as a quick guidance for you. The AGM, the annual general meeting, obviously by its name, is actually held every year. And that's usually, it is actually specified in the bylaws. It's usually held at a specific time of the year, usually just before the set general meeting at that point in the year. And as part of that, its main outcome is to review the annual audit report and adopt that, and then go into the election process, along with delivering a number of other reports. But the primary reason for the AGM is actually the audit report, because it gives clarity that the last year's operations of the PNC were kosher and everything's fine, and that people who are actually stepping in to the role have a degree of certainty that the PNC is being run well. The most common type of meeting you will have is the general meeting, and they are usually held every month, or in some cases every term, depending on your PNC. And they're usually held at a specific date or time in that month, according to your bylaws. And that's where you deal with PNC Association business in the main. So most of your decision making will be occurring in the general meeting space. The other type of meeting you can have is a special or extraordinary meeting, and that is when required. There's special conditions that are set up for calling a special meeting that you need to adhere to. There's certain type of notice. You need a special meeting usually when you are between general meetings and you need to have a decision made quickly. It is specific business related, so only items that are on the agenda for the special meeting are discussed at that. There's no general business. There's no taking of membership or any of that sort of thing. A special meeting is targeted specifically for a reason or a couple of reasons in terms of agenda items. It does the meeting, decides on those items, and then closes. The other type of meeting you would have is an executive meeting. Some PNCs have them, some do not, depending on the size of your PNC and the sort of operations you are undertaking. So there are also, when required, if you are running a more extensive set of operations, this would probably be happening once a month before a general meeting. But again, it depends on your circumstances. And the sort of thing that's discussed in the executive meeting is operational business. So it's discussing specific parts of the operation of the PNC and particular compliance requirements or staffing, supply issues, all of those sort of things that are operational related. The other and final type is subcommittee meetings, and this only depends on whether you have subcommittees or not. Subcommittee meetings are usually done every month or every term based on the general meeting. We suggest that you have them prior to, because the subcommittee is required to report to the PNC at a general meeting. And those subcommittee meetings are closed meetings for the subcommittee members generally, but they can call in other people with expertise if they so wish. And again, they're dealing with the specific operations of the subcommittee's terms of reference. So that's a really broad brushstroke over what meetings you have in terms of the PNC. There's a much more detail on these meetings in the bylaws that are on the members portal. So if you read through those, you can get a really good idea of who calls the meeting, how much notice you need, what you need to do in case the meeting needs to be postponed or adjourned, quorum, all that sort of stuff is specified in those. It's too much detail to go into tonight. A little bit about bank accounts under governance, and this comes up quite often. Only office bearers can be signatories to PNC Association accounts. Now, this is written into the Constitution. It is basically an immutable thing. You can't change it. I know a lot of people find it difficult to deal with because they would love to give their canteen manager the ability to sign off on stuff. The reason it was initially put in is obviously for safety reasons. It's keeping the signatories confined to people who are elected in a position of trust. And it is what it is at this point in time. So bear in mind that it's only office bearers that can be signatories to the accounts. Each account needs to have at least 2 signatures to operate. I don't know of anyone that really operates with 3 or more, but generally the operation is that you need at least 2 people to sign those accounts in order to withdraw funds. And that's whether it's the old check method or it's electronic. It still needs a method where at least 2 office bearers authorize that transaction. You need a minimum of 2 office bearers for the PNC to function in the first instance. So a question we're often asked is, how many office bearers can we get away with before we can't do anything? And the answer to that is 2, because of the minimum signatory requirement. So if you have 2 office bearers, you're right at the bare minimum to actually operate in order for paying bills. If you have 1, yes, you're in a bit of a pickle. We would suggest you give us a call and we'll be able to walk you through what you could possibly do to get yourself out of that situation. And it is recommended that all of your office bearers become signatories, and that you do this as a process within the AGM, that you would pass a motion to make sure that everyone that's coming on as an office bearer gets named as a signatory for the bank's purpose. Because when you trot down to the bank to try and get this done, they often look at you and go, really? Unless you've got an official document like minutes, they will often tell you where the door is. And we're getting that more and more after the Banking Royal Commission. So be aware that that side of things needs a little bit more of an official follow through on part of the PNC. Recommending all office bearers, you've got backups in case somebody's not available at the time. And it's as simple as that. A little bit on the expenditure of funds. Again, this is an area that can often go astray if there's no clear process. So in terms of doing anything that will expend funds, and that even means coming down to the fact of saying, we're going to do a FAPE, we're going to do a fundraiser. At some point, you will need to expend funds in order to carry out that activity. So you need to be really mindful that that needs to be a decision made by the members. So any expenditure needs to go as an agenda item on the meeting at which it will be discussed and decided. That gives an official record that the item has been at least put on the agenda for discussion. You've got to have a treasurer's report in this process, because if you're going to make a decision to expend funds of the PNC Association, it's just plain and simple good practice to know that you've got the money in the bank to do it. And having a treasurer's report presented at the same meeting at which you're making that decision gives you a great degree of certainty that you'll be able to have funds, hopefully, to be able to cover the thing you're about to approve. If not, you've got the evidence in front of you to say you can't afford to do it. The decision actually needs to be recorded in the minutes. Minutes are official records of the decisions made at your meetings, and they can actually be used as legal documents should there be a potential legal issue out of the end of that. So it's really important that the decision needs to be recorded in the minutes. If they are not recorded in the minutes and they are not brought for a decision at the PNC, they are not considered official decisions of the PNC. And at that point, there's no reason why the PNC should move forward. So you need to get this recorded in the minutes, and you need to have it discussed and appropriately approved through a formal motion at your meeting. And of course, the meeting has to be a legitimate meeting. It can't be a last minute thing that we've got to rush this through. There is nothing so urgent in a PNC that needs you to rush something. Take your time, put it on the agenda, discuss it, and get it through. The meeting has to be legitimate in the sense that it has to be a properly constituted meeting. That means it has to have the right amount of notice, and it has to have a quorum at the time the decision was being made. So it's really important that that has occurred, because otherwise the decision can be called into question. So now I'm going to dig down a little bit into probably one of the main reasons why you're actually here tonight, is to look at the office bearers in particular. And roles and responsibilities comes up time and time again, people trying to understand what their actual roles and responsibilities are. I'm going to do a fairly broad brushstroke here, but it'll give you a really good idea of what each of the office bearers' roles and responsibilities is. And if you need more detail, by all means contact us and we can provide you some extra material and guidance on how this plays out in real life. So the president, as a lot of people would probably assume, is the king of the castle, the one with the title. And if you were thinking that, it's not necessarily the case. The president is actually simply the chairperson of the PNC. They chair all of the meetings, and as part of that process, they're responsible for making sure that the agenda for the meeting gets completed in a reasonable time frame, that they contain the meeting in terms of the behaviour of members, and that the order and process of making those decisions is carried out appropriately. The other thing that a president does is they act as the spokesperson for the PNC, whether that's at school events or it's external to the PNC, for media, for instance. It's usually the president that will fulfill that role. They also act as the school liaison, and this means that they actually work between the president and the principal, and the president work together to liaise with the school's executive. They set the agendas, but they should do that with consensus, and they act as the community leader and are seen as the community leader by the rest of the school community. Then you have both vice presidents, and it's quite common. A lot of people will put their name up for vice president, and I've been there and done that. It's a fairly cushy role, and you put your feet up on a chair and you wait for someone to come along and ask you to do something on the odd occasion. We would sort of contradict that and say the vice presidents are actually quite a crucial role, and they can actually help alleviate a lot of the burden on the president, the secretary, and the treasurer. And by that, they are backup chairpersons for the president. If the president's not available, the vice presidents would step into that role. They should be supporting the president, the secretary, and the treasurer by shadowing those roles. So you have, in a sense, some redundancy or some backup to understand those roles should the treasurer, the secretary, or the president not be available. And they can actually undertake oversight of key operations. So they can deal with working with children checks, which is actually quite an area of confidentiality that needs to be maintained quite tightly. They can deal with staffing or employees, for instance. So there's things that the vice presidents can do and should do. So if your vice president is thinking they're going to kick their shoes up and have a cushy journey through the year, make them think twice and get them to actually do some work to help support the rest of you. The secretary is fairly self-explanatory. They do the notification of meetings. They take the meeting minutes at meetings. They deal with the correspondence in and out from, that's whether it's snail mail or email correspondence coming into the PNC, and they deal with stuff that officially has to go out as well. They are tasked with keeping the records of the association, and they may well deal with the membership, taking new membership and updating the member register as well. The treasurer is obviously the person who deals with the finances of the PNC. And by this, I mean all of the finances of the PNC. So all of the concerns, whether it's a canteen, uniform shop, bush, whatever it might be that the PNC operates, the treasurer needs to be over all of that as a consolidated piece of work. They're also responsible for liaising with the auditor that's chosen at the AGM and making sure that audit process is underway and that the audit is delivered prior to the next AGM. They're responsible for reporting at PNC general meetings on the finances, and they're responsible for making sure that they keep track of the assets of the PNC Association. And they can also be involved in the membership process. So they may well be the one that's doing the membership and the member register. Again, it's up to the PNC to decide whether it's the secretary, the treasurer, or combination of both that deals with that. So that's the roles and responsibilities of you as an office bearer in a nutshell. There is obviously a little bit more detail to this, but that gives you a very broad brushstroke over what you should be looking at in terms of your role. Office bearers do have particular responsibilities, and under government agencies or under particular laws, you're referred to as responsible persons. So that government agencies only want to see the office bearers or an office bearer named in terms of contact person for that agency. And you have those particular responsibilities depending on which agency you are talking to. You also have a responsibility in dealing with the access over the members portal and the affiliate email, because from PNC Federation end, we only talk to office bearers primarily as the representatives of your PNC association. So it's really, really important that you keep your details up to date in the members portal, and that you have control of the affiliate email process and not giving the passwords out to every all and sundry in your PNC. You're also signatories to the bank accounts, as I've talked about before. You're involved, particularly although this is a government agency, you're involved in the child protection process. Working with children checks is a confidential process. The information you garner from people is confidential. It needs to be confined to the office bearers only. And should there be a breach in any regard to child protection, it is the office bearers responsible for dealing with that. Complaints and grievances, and I know a lot of people don't want to deal with this. It's all too hard, but having a good complaints and grievances process in place is really important, and it is the office bearers that need to be able to deal with that. And that may mean going out to an external free agency to deal with mediation or such. Again, if you have problems in that space, come and talk to PNC Federation. We'll be able to give you some guidance there. If you employ people, and this is only if you have employees, you have to deal with a whole range of employment-related responsibilities. And it's only the office bearers. Again, this is highly confidential and personal information you are dealing with. It's only the office bearers that should be dealing with it. And along with that would come a work health and safety component as well. That means that the office bearers would be responsible for the work health and safety of all employees and volunteers on site, along with the shared responsibility with the school. So they would need to be aware of what those responsibilities were and undertake the appropriate actions under work health and safety. A little bit on directors' IDs, and we get asked this question recently because of the urgent need to do the directors' IDs in certain instances. Just an indication that PNC Association office bearers do not require directors' IDs. That's only for companies under the Corporations Act. So don't stress, you do not need to go through that process. And if your auditor or accountant is telling you otherwise, tell them to ring us and we'll put them straight. A little bit quickly on not-for-profit. This is an area that's really not understood that well. A PNC is a not-for-profit organisation, whether you're registered as a charity or not. And people often think not-for-profit means you can't make any money. You've just got to give it all away to the school. And that's not the case at all. So a not-for-profit basically means that you can't operate for the financial benefit or gain of your members, any responsible persons, meaning your executive or office bearers, or friends or relatives of the above. Now, in general practice, yes, you're running an operation that will, in a sense, benefit members of the PNC by the fact that you're donating to the school. But the idea is you're donating to the broader community, not just to the members of your association. So that's perfectly fine to do, as long as you're not giving those benefits just to your members or to your office bearers. You're perfectly fine in that space. And it also means you can't pay your office bearers to carry out their role, despite the fact that a lot of office bearers do a lot of work and would love to be paid for their time. But no, that's definitely not the case. You can't share your profits or surplus with members and their families. The surplus has to go back into the school. And you can only expend funds on the organisational objectives. So you can't expend funds outside of the objectives we talked to before. So for a PNC, that means you can only spend funds on the school. But it does mean you can actually spend money on administration, in other words, the cost of doing business. You can make a surplus and there's no limits on that. You can keep funds in reserve, again, no limits on that. But of course, there's questions will be asked if a PNC is holding on to hundreds of thousands of dollars for multiple years with no expectation of that money ever being spent on something. And you're able to invest in funds, those funds in term deposits, even in shares. If that's the case, I suggest you don't look at cryptocurrency. That's a whole new ball game and high risk. and you would run commercial activities like canteens, uniforms, and ushers. They're all things that you can do as a not-for-profit. A little bit about operating as a charity, and I'm just going to cover this quickly because it's really important to understand that there are benefits that come with being a registered charity. That means you can access tax concessions, both for income tax and GST if you're registered for GST. And the income tax can actually be significant. If you are not registered, the tax man will come and collect money out of your income, which would otherwise go to the school if you were a registered charity. And the other thing it provides for is the ability to apply for DGR status, a deductible gift recipient status, which means that you could set up a building fund at the school, which will support doing various building works at the school, and any contributions made to that are tax deductible for the people making contributions to them. There is a caveat around that. To maintain your charity status, you have to operate as a not-for-profit without question, and you need to meet your obligations to the ACNC because they're the body that regulates charities in Australia. And there's 4 conditions in there about what you have to do, and it's basically administrative in nature. So an annual information statement, you need to keep your responsible persons up to date. You need to meet any financial accounting requirements the ACNC requires, and you need to comply with the ACNC governance standards as well. Not difficult things to comply with from a PNC's perspective. And again, just a reminder, your charitable purposes are your first 2 objectives as a PNC. All right, a little bit about legal obligations before we get to the final Q&A. So a PNC association is surrounded by a number of legal frameworks that you need to be aware of. And I'm only going to touch on this at the moment. There's more detail available on the members portal and on our website about this. And if you have specific questions, we can help you through member services. The first of that is if you are a charity, there is a whole range of things you need, as I've just indicated, that you need to be aware of to act as a charity and to maintain your status as a charity. Tax, you can't get away from, no matter what walk of life you're in. You will be paying some form of tax, or at least reporting to the ATO in some way, shape or form. Child protection, again, is a mandatory requirement, and you need to be very well aware of your requirements and obligations under the Child Protection Act. Again, there's some extensive information we have on our website and in the members portal about what's required in that space. Privacy, although it doesn't apply to directly apply to a lot of PNCs because there is a financial ceiling under which it doesn't apply. Privacy is a tricky space because in this litigious age, it is likely that if you do accidentally or by omission release people's personal or private or confidential information, they can still come at you and sue the PNC or the individuals on the PNC. So it's really good practice, even though the privacy law doesn't specifically apply to most PNCs, to have some privacy practices in place. If you're doing anything to do with running a lottery or serving liquor, there's requirements in that space as well that you need to be aware of. If you are running a canteen or you are doing a barbecue of any kind or food service of any kind, whether it's in the school or to the external community, you need to be aware of the food safety regulations. That is tightening this year. There are new regulations coming in that will require mandatory person with qualification in food safety and some ongoing training for volunteers and other people as well. The other part of that is consumer law. If you're running a uniform shop, for instance, you need to have a return and exchange policy in that space. And you need to be aware that there are basic consumer protections about how people purchase goods from you and how they are able to return those goods. And then the biggie that sits in here is employment. So if you employ anybody in a PNC association, you add a whole range of new things in here. So there's the National Employment Standards, Work Health and Safety, Workers' Compensation, Superannuation, and Awards. So those things come into play in that space when you employ. They're not insurmountable by any ways, and there's plenty of ways to make your life simpler in the PNC space. Again, come and talk to us about that, and we'll be able to walk you through how to make your life a little bit easier. And again, PNCs are actually exempt from requiring an authority to fundraise. So if anyone tells you where's your authority, you can't do this fundraise, we're exempt under legislation from requiring an authority to fundraise. Quick thing on reporting, and then we'll be right at the end. There are 4 main things that you as office bearers need to be aware of in terms of reporting. The Australian Business Register, you have to keep your responsible persons up to date. You have to have a contact person for your ATO contact, and there's quarterly BATS requirements usually in that space. PNC Federation, if you are incorporated under us, we require audited accounts annually, and you need to keep your member responsible people up to date as well through MRUs. And the ACNC has an annual information statement, which is required in all cases, and you need to keep your responsible persons as well. So they're just the things to be aware of in terms of your external reporting obligations as a PNC. And that's it from me. I've spoken enough. I hope it gives you a little bit of a taste of what a PNC is, what your role in the PNC is, and the sort of obligations a PNC has. So we're happy to take questions now if there are any. Looks like Lorraine's answered all the questions by the sound of it. Well, there is a question on privacy in terms of it's what is entailed in privacy. Privacy is personal information of an individual. So under legislation, that includes a person's name, address, driver's license details, phone number. All of those things are considered personal information items. And by having a breach of those details unnecessarily could cause that person an issue, whether their identity is stolen as a result of that, or it causes some other financial hardship or societal hardship for that person. There is a right for that person to come back at the entity that disclosed their information to sue them for damages in that case. So that's really what I'm referring to in that privacy space. Okay, so good question. On the point of signatories for office bearers, would executive members count as office bearers? And the answer to that is no, it is the big 5. They are the office bearers or the officers of the association. The other executive members are just part of the executive, which is a broader group. So no, you can't have them as signatories in this case. Okay. Do all PNCs have to lodge a tax return, or only those running a business like a canteen? Again, this is a question a little bit out of my realm. I'm not an accountant, but basically if you are running a business, because you will have an ABN, and there is a requirement to report to the ATO, usually on a quarterly basis, of the activities that you have conducted. And if you're a registered charity, by and large, there is no tax to pay on that. You are only simply reporting on your earnings and outgoings. Again, depending on your circumstances, you would be seeking a little bit of advice from an accountant about what your obligations are in that space. Okay, what's the best way to support on multiple issues facing our PNCs arising from this webinar? Can someone from Federation meet with us? A really good question. Yes, we will be putting the recording up, and that recording will be free to share, if you like, with your members, if you so wish. If you would like PNC Federation to come out and explain these things in more detail to your members, contact member services, and we're more than happy to arrange a time with you for a virtual catch-up. We do everything these days virtually, so we can set up a Zoom meeting for you. You can invite your members in, and we can do a one-on-one Q&A session with you, or an information session with you. Can a DET teacher be a president? And the answer to that question is yes, provided they meet the eligibility criteria. Now, that means they either have a child at the school or they live in the school's catchment area as the eligibility criteria. And the other caveat I would put around that is that they are a teacher that's employed by the Department of Education. They would have to declare a potential conflict of interest because they have a foot in both camps. And potentially as a teacher, the principal's sitting in the room with them, and there's often some tension between doing what the boss expects them to do and sitting there as a parent representative, or in this case, the chair. All right, I'm going to take a couple of more questions and we'll start wrapping up. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to everything you've got tonight. How do we update the responsible persons for the ABR and the ACNC? There's two good questions in this. The ACNC is relatively simple. They have a portal where you can log in with your details, update your responsible persons in that site. The ABR is a little bit more complex because they only generally take one person as a rule. And if that person has rolled off your PNC, you need to hold on to them if you can, because that person needs to then help you move to a new responsible person. We're in discussions with the ABR about that at the moment because it's quite inconvenient for PNCs, and in some cases, downright infuriating. Okay, would we need a special meeting if we discover we can't locate the bylaws and want to use the recommended ones? No, you don't need a special meeting. There is the bylaws, if you're going to do them, we suggest 1 month's notice for a change of bylaws, whether you're adopting new ones or changing existing ones. That notice would include the changes that you're proposing to the bylaws. Make sure the members have the full month to digest what's going on with those bylaws. And then from there, you would have a general meeting in order to do the adoption of those. If for some reason it's time critical, you could call a special meeting to do it, but generally that's not necessary. Okay. I'll do one last question. Okay. We have a member register that people mark off for attendance at meetings. Should they only include a name and not mobile and email addresses? Your member register, the one that you actually officially keep as a record of your members, would not necessarily need to have would have the mobile and contact addresses for your members so that you can email them and contact them should that be necessary. That register is kept by the secretary or the treasurer. If you are passing around an attendance sheet, which I think is what you're referring to, that would just have people's names indicated on it. And then the treasurer or a secretary in this instance can know which person at the meeting is actually a member when it comes to voting. So no, you only do the email address and phone number at the time the person actually joins as a member of the PNC, and it's recorded by the treasurer or the secretary at the time and put in the proper member register. So that concludes us for tonight. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I would be happy to go on more, but I'm being wound up at the moment. So thank you very much for attending this evening. I hope it's been of use to you. Just as a parting few comments to you, this webinar's recording will be available within a week on the members portal, along with any unanswered questions we haven't got to tonight. We do have some upcoming webinars. There's one on eSafety 101 with the e-safety group coming in on the 23rd of March. And we have an opportunity class placement webinar on the 29th of March. Those have already been locked in. We do have a couple of other member services webinars coming up. One will be on the new online community, which you can register for through the members portal. Provide your own email address so you have your own individual login, and then you can participate in what is a growing PNC community. And I strongly suggest, if you haven't looked at that already, to go and investigate that, get a login and check out what's being talked about in the PNC world and contribute as well. And we'll be running a webinar on that soon about how to use the community, what's available there, and how you can interact with that. So in closing, just a reminder that we do, as a member organisation, provide advice and guidance to our members, and that's our core business. Our website contains a huge range of information along with the members portal, and feel free to browse that, and if you can't find anything, by all means give us a call and we'll be able to direct you to the right information. If you need to call us, we're open from Monday to Friday between 9 and 4. And we also can, as I've already stated, deliver some information sessions, one-on-one sessions with you, provided you invite us to come in and do so. You'll be asked to do a little survey at the end of this recording. So if you could bear with that, just to give us a little bit of feedback on how tonight's webinar went, that would be greatly appreciated, and goes towards improving the webinar program as we move forward. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Good night and enjoy the rest of your night.